This story happened a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. It is already over. Nothing can be done to change it. It is a story of love and loss, brotherhood and betrayal, courage and sacrifice and the death of dreams. It is a story of the blurred line between our best and our worst. It is the story of the end of an age. A strange thing about stories. Though this all happened so long ago and so far away that words cannot describe the time or the distance, it is also happening right now, right here. It is happening as you listen to these words. This is how 25 millennia come to a close. Corruption and treachery have crushed 1,000 years of peace. This is not just the end of a republic. Night is falling on civilization itself. This is the twilight of the Jedi. The end starts now.
Hello everyone, today I'm gonna review one of my favorite Star Wars novels of all time, Star Wars Episode 3 Revenge of the Sith, written by Matthew Stover. So the reason why I'm reviewing this book is because it's one of my favorite Star Wars Expanded Universe novels that I've ever read. I think that of course it's way better than the movie, which most of the time when there's a novel version of a movie, the novel version is always better, and in this case it's no exception. However, in this novel it's much better explained. The story is much more developed, it has more depth, the characters are much more intriguing, and also in this version of episode 3 you really understand and are convinced of Anakin's actions, because of course in the movie you understand why Anakin turns to the dark side. It's mainly to save Padme, and he distrusts the Jedi to some point, but you're not convinced actually that Anakin would genuinely believe the Chancellor when he says that the Jedi are traitors and that they attempted a coup against him. Whereas in the novel it's explored to a much greater lengths of depth, and you're convinced of the Chancellor's arguments when he talks to Anakin, how he paints the Jedi. There's much more scenes where the Chancellor really takes his time to groom Anakin and to really sort of coax him to the dark side and to seed the seeds of doubt about the Jedi and even about Padme, which is really interesting. So that's the main reason why I think this book is so much more important than the movie, because the movie is fun, the action, the special effects are all really great, but you're not convinced from a story's perspective that Anakin would genuinely believe, turn to the dark side in such a rushed way as in the movie. Basically, once he betrays Mace Windu, Anakin just turns full dark side and just doesn't question Palpatine's actions and his orders. He just blindly accepts everything just to save Padme, and you're not convinced that it would actually play out this way in real life. Whereas in the book, I don't want to spoil it, but the Chancellor really is convincing, and Anakin, even when he betrays Mace Windu, he still is not convinced by the Chancellor, and he says, well, I'm not ready to do this and that, and the Chancellor says, well, if you don't do this, this is what's going to happen, you have to do this because otherwise you're not going to get what you want. And he basically gives him more arguments to really push him to the very end and to be sure that Anakin will turn, and it's convincing. So that's the reason why I think the book is so much better than the movie, and why I think you should read it. It's really important to take into account that this novel is the real story, I think, that George Lucas wanted to show in the movie. But of course, because of time limitations that a movie have, he couldn't put as many scenes. And there's even a plot regarding some senators that are distrustful of the Chancellor, the petition of 2000s, which Padme is a part of. And the Chancellor is even capable of outsmarting them, which is really admirable. And you really can't refrain yourself from admiring the Chancellor in the way that he is so good at manipulating things and turning enemies to his advantage, making useful idiots out of his enemies. And that's really interesting when you read it.
Kenobi's master had been Qui-Gon Jinn, Dooku's own Padawan. Dooku had fenced Qui-Gon thousands of times, and he knew every weakness of the Ataro form, with its ridiculous acrobatics. He drove a series of flashing thrusts toward Kenobi's legs to draw the Jedi Master into a flipping overhead leap so that Dooku could burn through his spine from kidneys to shoulder blades. And this image, this plan was so clear in Dooku's mind that he almost failed to notice that Kenobi met every one of his thrusts without so much as moving his feet, staying perfectly centered, perfectly balanced, blade never moving a millimeter more than was necessary, deflecting without effort, riposting with flickering strikes and stabs swifter than the tongue of a Garolian ghost viper. And when Dooku felt Skywalker regain his feet and stride once more toward his back, he finally registered the source of that blinding defensive velocity Kenobi had used a moment ago. And only then, belatedly, did he understand that Kenobi's Ataro and Shi'icho had been ploys as well. Kenobi had become a master of Sorisu.
One thing to keep in mind when you're reading the book is that the author is a martial arts specialist. And this is obvious by the fact that the fight scenes are really well written, and you really feel excited when you read them. So, for example, in the first fight scene where Count Dooku is facing off against Anakin and Obi-Wan in the Invisible Hand, the fight scenes are really well written because they're written from a strategic perspective rather than just the action and the swings of the blades, etc. It's really written in a strategic perspective, and this is really interesting because in other books it's not the case. And this adds a level of depth that other fight scenes in other books don't have. So, in the first fight scene, Dooku has a specific strategy on how he believes at first that he's gonna best Obi-Wan and Anakin easily. But it turns out that at some point he discovers that his strategy is not viable anymore and that he's gonna probably lose unless he adapts. And you really get into his mind, into how he's going to do it, and you wonder especially how he's going to do it given the fact that he's basically cornered at some point. And this is really interesting. And also one thing to take into consideration is that each character has a specific fighting style that is described. Each of them has its specific flaws but also advantages. So at one point Dooku is fighting off against Obi-Wan, and he thinks that Obi-Wan is sticking to his old fighting style, which he has a specific strategy on how to exploit its weaknesses, only to find out that Obi-Wan has tricked him and has actually developed a new fighting style, which he can no longer best easily, and that he has to change his strategy in order to win, and the stakes are high. No fight scene is taken for granted on who's going to be the winner. And this is really good because it keeps you on your toes and you really sympathize with each character, even the foes, because you want them to last as much as possible in order to keep the fight interesting. And it's really, really good, and I really praise the author for how he wrote the fight scenes, and it really shows that he's passionate about martial arts, which is one of his specialties.
The dragon reminds him every night that someday he will lose Obi-Wan, he will lose Padme, or they will lose him. All things die, Anakin Skywalker. Even stars burn out. And the only answers he ever has for these dead, cold whispers are his memories of Obi-Wan's voice, or Yoda's. But sometimes he can't quite remember them. All things die. He can barely even think about it.
Something worth mentioning in this book is the fact that early on in the book and throughout the book, it is mentioned that Anakin has a lot of fear in him, and it is basically metaphorically described as a dragon. Anakin feels that he has a dragon inside of him that's constantly whispering his worst fear, which is that he will lose the people who are closest to him. So first he lost his mother, of course, in Attack of the Clones, and now the dragon is basically telling him that he will lose Padme. And this is something I liked because in the book, this really goes to show the depths of Anakin's fears. They're not mere fears of him that are just mentioned. It is metaphorically shown, and basically this fear has morphed into a creature, a dragon, that he constantly fears, and even when he turns to the dark side and thinks that he has mastered and controlled his fears, in the end he still thinks the dragon is there, even though he killed it rather, only to think again that the dragon is still alive. And it really helps sympathize with him in the sense that you really feel his exasperation in regards to his own fears, and he doesn't know how to control them. And he really curses the Force, because Anakin, of course, is somebody who's extremely strong in the Force, being the chosen one. But at the end, what good is the Force if it only gives him a terrible premonition about what's to come? It's almost a curse rather than a gift, sort of. And this is something that is really important in the development of the character.
Anakin shook his head. Because the Sith are evil. From a Jedi's point of view, Palpatine allowed, evil is a label we all put on those who threaten us, isn't it? Yet the Sith and the Jedi are similar in almost every way, including their quest for greater power. The Jedi's quest is for greater understanding, Anakin countered, for greater knowledge of the Force, which brings with it greater power, does it not? Well, yes. Anakin had to laugh. I should know better than to argue with a politician. We're not arguing, Anakin. We're just talking. Palpatine shifted his weight, settling in comfortably. Perhaps the real difference between the Jedi and the Sith lies only in their orientation. A Jedi gains power through understanding, and a Sith gains understanding through power. This is the true reason the Sith have always been more powerful than the Jedi. The Jedi fear the dark side so much, they cut themselves off from the most important aspect of life. Passion. Of any kind. They don't even allow themselves to love. Except for me, Anakin thought. But then, I've never been exactly the perfect Jedi.
Of course, the best part about the novel and even the movie is Palpatine's machinations and how he handles turning Anakin to the dark side. Because in the novel, it's much more explained and goes to greater lengths of depth than in the movie on how Palpatine does it. But Palpatine does it on so many fronts, and that's why it's so impressive. Because Palpatine doesn't just manipulate Anakin through his feelings, for example, his fear of losing Padme, but also through his political views and how he really thinks. Because Anakin, at the end of the day, agrees with Palpatine, he just doesn't want to admit it. And Palpatine basically debates him to push him logically and willingly to turn to his side. Unlike other villains who just try to control people by force, he tries to legitimately make them believe that he's right and willingly join him. So, for example, in the opera scene, Palpatine goes into much more depth in order to coax Anakin to the dark side. He basically debates Anakin rather than just talk to him like in the movie. In the novel, Palpatine is literally debating him, and whenever Anakin is replying, he's only replying with shallow answers that the Jedi have told him, and basically even Palpatine says, "I hear Obi-Wan's voice in you," rather than the voice of Anakin. And Anakin is left with no arguments to reply to the Chancellor. He's basically stuck in a dilemma where he's basically thinking to himself, he's right, and he agrees with him. One thing that is really interesting in the novel is how Palpatine handles politics. So Palpatine manages to deflect all the blame away from him and to the Jedi easily, because whatever the Jedi criticize the Chancellor for could also be criticized for the Jedi. So for example, the Jedi order Anakin to spy on the Chancellor, But Palpatine can easily turn the tables around by simply asking Anakin to do him a favor and to report on any Jedi suspicious activity. And this is a masterful move because Anakin at some point confronts the Chancellor and says, Palpatine, you're using all these executive powers to gain more power. But Palpatine simply shrugs and says, oh, you know, it's the Jedi who are power hungry. They're just hiding their intentions because at the end of the day, they're using the war as an opportunity to undermine the power of the Senate and of the Supreme Chancellor of the Republic. And I'm just using these executive powers to win the war. And once it's over, I'm going to give away these privileges. And so this is something that is really interesting because Palpatine is able to frame his enemies for what he's responsible. And simply, if he is capable of doing the same things that Jedi do, but because he is so wise in the way he uses his words, the words that he employs specifically, it seems as if he's not giving orders to Anakin, but rather simply friendly requests. And this makes all the difference in the long term. And speaking of which, the Jedi are really outsmarted at every move. In the novel, whenever Anakin meets with the Chancellor basically gives him a few arguments, and he basically throws to Anakin a few one-liners and very specific words and sentences that stick to his mind. And when Anakin meets with the Jedi, like Obi-Wan and the rest of the Council, the Jedi make blunders that the Chancellor has predicted they would. And so Anakin really pushes Anakin to highlight the Jedi's flaws, which only helps Palpatine's agenda at the end of the day, because Anakin grows intensively more doubtful of the Jedi. And also another thing that's really specific to the novel compared to the movie is that in the novel, Palpatine even antagonizes Padme, unlike in the movie. In the movie, the Chancellor is really doubtful about the fact that Anakin should not be antagonized with his wife, whereas in the novel, Palpatine puts them at odds. So Padme in the novel is part of a petition of doubtful senators who are basically distrustful of the Chancellor. They're called the Petitioners of 2000. And basically in the novel, Palpatine even says to Anakin, sometimes the people who are the closest to us are the ones who in the end, you know, don't see far enough and are at odds against us. And Anakin is even doubtful, and it really that's what also contributes to Anakin's decision to choke Padme at the end. It's that he basically, once again, it's Palpatine's machinations that play into his mind and help him make this one step further towards distrusting his wife, which is really important. And also what I really like is that Palpatine wins because at the end of the day, the Jedi are not perfect and they're flawed. But it only takes a few flaws for Palpatine to win. Palpatine doesn't need an enemy that is filled with flaws. He only needs an enemy that has a few flaws, enough for him to exploit in great lengths. So for example, the fact that the Jedi are really strict about not refraining from embracing love and really going into the heights of passion. This is what really pushes Anakin to the dark side, because he cannot have a normal life and he doesn't feel happy. And this is a major flaw that Palpatine can exploit to great length. Not only that, but the Jedi are also considered as a very undemocratic society, because they basically elect their members by fiat. And this is how Palpatine can basically convince Anakin that they are not to be trusted, because if they rule the galaxy, why wouldn't they rule it as they rule themselves? Basically, not through vote, but through council decision. And this is something really smart and well put in the book, is that the Jedis have only a few flaws, but it's enough for the Chancellor to exploit them into great lengths. So for all of those reasons and much more, which I can't cover all, I really appreciate how the Chancellor's machinations are described in the book.
The dark is generous. Its first gift is concealment. Our true faces lie in the dark beneath our skins. Our true hearts remain shadowed deeper still. But the greatest concealment lies not in protecting our secret truths, but in hiding from us the truths of others. The dark protects us from what we dare not know. Its second gift is comforting illusion, the ease of gentle dreams in night's embrace, the beauty that imagination brings to what would repel in day's harsh light. But the greatest of its comforts is the illusion that the dark is temporary, that every night brings a new day, because it is day that is temporary. Day is the illusion.
One thing I really liked and I found interesting in the book is the definition of evil and how it describes it. It's really short, but it's well written, and I wanted to share with you. So basically it goes like this, is that unlike what many people would think rationally, evil is not something at first that seems disgusting and vile and repulsive. Evil is something that is in fact seductive when you're first facing off with. It's something that is seductive, that is attractive because it promises to solve your problems, most importantly in the short term, only to find out that once you're hooked to it, it takes everything from you. It's well written in the book. It said that the dark, well, it's basically evil. The dark is generous, because at the end of the day, that's what people who are evil do. They're generous towards you. I don't want to get too political, but in real life, the politicians that promise the most are the ones who in the end will give the less. They only do it because they want you to believe in them, and once you give them power, they take everything from you. Whereas people who are good, who are benevolent, who are pure, those people are in fact cold at first because they don't make promises they can't honor. And they seem cold, and they seem discompassionate, which is how the Jedi are portrayed in the book towards Anakin. Anakin feels that the Jedi are not giving him what he wants, that they're cold toward him, that they resent him for his power and his talent, that they're holding him back, whereas the Chancellor is seen as the generous person, who is Anakin's caring father, who is there for him, who can be with whom Anakin can be honest towards. And once Anakin trusts Palpatine takes everything from him. In the end, he's left with nothing, and that's really important. And I think this is almost like a life lesson that you can take from the book, and I really liked it. One thing that I really like about the novels in the expanded universe is that the content is more mature, but also the villains are much more developed and are much more intimidating. Chief among them are Grievous and Dooku. So Grievous in this novel is really menacing, and he's a far better villain than in the movie. In the movie, Grievous is a joke, and he really falls short compared to the 2003 Clone Wars animated series, where he was absolutely terrifying. In this novel, he's sort of in between, but he's definitely a good character. Dooku, on the other hand, is explored in his political views. So in the movie, you just feel like he's basically accepting whatever Palpatine is ordering him. But in this novel, you discover that in fact he despises Grievous, and he has disgust for him, and that he wants really another version of the Empire than what Palpatine wants. Dooku is really insisting on having an empire of human beings, sort of like an empire that is pure and that is really oriented in the species that it encompasses. And you really don't get this in the movie. In the movie, you just get that he's evil like Palpatine, that he wants an empire. But in the novel, you discover that in fact he is a speciesist, and that it adds another layer to his evilness, of the fact that he's really, like his title says, Darth Tyrannus. He's a tyrant who has a hierarchy, and it adds to his snobbery, his aristocratic demeanor, which I think is really good because it adds another layer to his villainy. Overall, I would give it a 9 out of 10, and I would say that this novel is definitely worth a reading, especially with the audiobook read by Jonathan Davis. Awesome narrator. The only reason why this book is not perfect is because the ending feels a bit rushed. Compared to the movie, the ending fight is a bit too fast-paced, and you feel like the author doesn't give as much detail as in the fight with Dooku. It feels like as if he's rushed and he has to make it quick, whereas in the movie the fight is really epic and it's really this ultimate fight where the stakes are super high. In the novel it feels like it's a really important fight, but just as important as the one with Dooku, which is definitely not in the same league. So aside from that, I would say that this book is excellent, and I would definitely recommend that you read it after watching the movie so you really can absorb the additions that this novel brings to the story.